Great. Thank you, Chip. Before we dive into getting some thoughts and feedback from this particular panel, I'd like to take a moment to share with you who are the panel members and a little bit about them so that you can get that perspective and appreciate what they're going to offer to this conversation. Chip, I think you didn't do a very good introduction of yourself. You were very modest. It's pretty amazing when you look at Chip's resume and you see the 25 years of experience, bringing not only industry but also bringing his time period with FDA, but also as a very active board member for MDIC. Truly is the champion behind these clinical trial sciences, and you could clearly hear that passion in his presentation just a few minutes ago. So thank you for all that you do for MDIC, but also for the medical device community as a whole. We also have with us Dr. Owen Faris from the FDA. Owen is the Clinical Trials Director for the Center of Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. And fortunately for those of us in the medical device field, we have had the privilege of knowing Owen and through his involvement in clinical trial policies, as well as overseeing FDA's decisions and policies with regard to clinical trials, especially in the area of early feasibility studies, as well as overseeing the Breakthrough Device Program. And as Chip mentioned, Owen was very involved in bringing this information forward and encouraging the companies to provide the information as it related to the early feasibility study. So thank you, Owen, for all that you've been doing over the past several years. Next to Owen is Dr. Mark Carlson. Dr. Carlson is the Division Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Abbott. Came to Abbott via St. Jude Medical just earlier this year. And Mark has been able to bring his medical expertise as well as his industry expertise to the board of MDIC. And again, we're very fortunate to have that breadth of experience coming to these different conversations. Next to Mark, we have Dr. Naomi Aronson. She is the Executive Director of Clinical Evaluation, Innovation, and Policy with Blue Cross Blue Shield. She is involved in leading various clinical effectiveness and policy engagement initiatives with the government, regulatory agency, as well as different policy organizations. We are extremely pleased to have Naomi with us today, representing the private payers and getting her perspective in this particular conversation. And next to Naomi, we have Dr. Jijo James. Dr. James is the Chief Medical Officer for Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices, where he leads medical safety, oversees patient monitoring, and safety surveillance practices. And as you can imagine, that's at the core of, and it's all about patients, which throughout this whole day, that's what we've continued to be reminded of and being brought back to. It truly is all about the patient, irrespective of what our individual perspectives are. And last but certainly not least is Randy Schiestl from Boston Scientific. Randy is the Vice President of Global Technology at Boston Scientific, where he leads a team of engineers and scientists to deliver computational analysis, technology road mapping, product design, packaging, labeling, knowledge management, and lab and test services. So quite a busy man for sure. Randy is also on the board of directors here at MDIC, and hopefully you were also able to see him along with others from MDIC and FDA receive the award this morning as it relates to virtual patient initiative. So congratulations, Randy, on that, and we look forward to actually seeing that particular initiative deployed. All right. So following that introduction, I want to thank Chip again for sharing the initiatives that have been going on really the past year to 2 years within MDIC, and combining those initiatives along with in the previous presentation, it was really a great reminder hearing the patient Margaret Sheehan remind us and bring us back to that call to action that really is about the patient. patient and everything that we're doing and what we're trying to do. I hope the panel would agree with me that I really truly believe that in the past couple years, the collaboration, the bantering that occurs back and forth between industry, between the regulatory authorities, between the patient advocacy groups really demonstrate how much we have come in the past couple years in our relationships, and that we really are driven and motivated by the very core being the patients. So to kick us off with this discussion, I'd like to ask Owen a particular question and say, Owen, what would you recommend to the medical device companies here in this audience, as well as those that are on the phone, that knowing that the best avenues to gather this clinical evidence are tools that are in the post-market setting, how do you encourage the medical device companies to be able to participate not only in the pre-market but in the post-market, and to appreciate the impact when they're making the decisions that they have to make in prioritizing, am I going to do something in the pre-market space, or am I going to do something in the post-market space?
Sure, thank you. So, Chip, I really liked your presentation, and I liked how you ended it with your Imagine slide. And, while it was an aspirational slide, I was also looking through the bullets and thinking, okay, we've made some progress there, we've made some progress here, we're making more progress there. And, to your question, Jennifer, I think your last two bullets, Chip, dealt with both patient input and real-world evidence. And so real-world evidence, I think, fits into a lot of what we gather is in the post-market. But I would say that we already have a lot of potential in the pre-market. And if we think about where's the lowest lying fruit. So Bill Murray today showed a slide that I think originally came from Jeff, of showing that when we have confidence that we're going to get high quality data in the post-market, that we'll get it quickly, that it will be reliable, that we can act upon it, that makes us much less risk averse to allow a product onto the market in the pre-market decision. And so, we already today see, whereas 5 or 6 years ago, we might have said, your PMA is approved, now go do this standalone post-approval study that's going to take a long time, it's going to cost a lot of money, we'll have challenges enrolling, and we may not, by the time we can act on something, it may not be relevant anymore. And today, every day, we see PMA letters that say, you're approved, and now we want to gather this real-world evidence as part of this registry. And we think we'll get it more quickly, we think we'll get it more reliably, and we'll be able to act on it. So, that's sort of one step. So now, this product's on the market. FDA doesn't regulate how that product's used. We don't regulate the practice of medicine. So in many cases, that product is used for uses that are beyond its approved label. If that data is gathered in a high quality, reliable way, we have submissions that come in every day today, pre-market submissions that say, here's what this device was originally approved for, here's how it's being used in the real world, and here's some high quality data that shows that it works. So that's a pre-market use today. Again, come talk with us, but these are happening today. We have companies coming in and saying, here's some real world data, we'd like this to be our control group data. Here is a mechanism for gathering high quality real world data. We'd like to have our pre-market clinical study be half its size that it would traditionally be, because we can gather that data from an existing registry for the control group. This is a way where we can make things move more quickly. All the patients enrolled in the investigational study are going to get the investigational device. We'll have much better follow-up. All of these sorts of concerns can be addressed. The Holy Grail that we're just starting to see happen today, but I think we'll see a lot more of, is when you can say, I want to do a new clinical trial, maybe it's a modification of an existing device, and instead of building from the ground up a new clinical study with all of the sites and all of the PIs and all of the infrastructure, instead I'm going to use an existing infrastructure. Maybe it will be a registry, maybe it will even be from an EMR, where this is how I'm going to gather the data for my clinical trial. That to me is the Holy Grail. That's in many places a little bit further down the road, but this is where we're going. But I think there's a lot of potential today, and the recommendation, I think, is come talk to us, come bring us these ideas. These will challenge all of us to move into this space, but I think there's a lot of potential. And when I think about the patient input information, it was a really great discussion that we just had in the last hour. I'm in meetings multiple times every week where we're having some version of a benefit risk assessment with incomplete information. You know, we're trying to decide, should this clinical trial go forward? Should this clinical trial be stopped based on the information we've seen? Should we approve this device? Should we act on this post-market data that indicates there may be a problem? And in all of those conversations, you know, we're trying to figure out, well, how do we balance the benefits and the risks? And in most of those conversations, we're making some sort of a guess as to what the patient values. That's starting to change. We're starting to have the opportunity to have real data on what is the patient value. So this is difficult enough when you have something that doesn't have good options. You know, we can maybe come up with a good idea as to what the patient values when there aren't good options. It's really difficult when there are decent options out there for a particular condition, but they have drawbacks. And how do you weigh those drawbacks compared to the events we may be seeing or the events we're worried about? And this is the area where if we have high quality data, while I do think, you know, the question came up in the previous session, is FDA sort of skeptical about this data? Sure, there's some skepticism, but I think that's healthy skepticism, and I think if you can demonstrate that this data is high quality and reliable, I think there'll be an enormous sense of relief, you know, that we can say, we now have information that can inform us on how we really should be assessing these benefits and risks and making our decisions. So I think there's a lot of potential. I think the main piece of advice is to have these conversations with us as soon as possible. You know, we want to engage. Our staff is extremely passionate about getting to the right answer and working with our external stakeholders to get there.
Great, thank you, Owen. Mark, I'd like to actually pose the same question to you, but from the perspective of a medical device company, where you are sitting with your colleagues in leadership at Abbott, and perhaps they may have not had the opportunity to sit next to Owen and hear these great examples of where the agency is going and how they're thinking about data. So what do you do in those situations, and how are you convincing your fellow colleagues in this conversation?
Sure. Well, first I would say that Owen said it extremely well, and I have something I can add to it, but he covered the landscape extremely well, and many of the things I would say are what Owen just said. Having said that, I think we're at a point of a paradigm shift where the concept of pre-market versus post-market is no longer as relevant as it once was. One could consider that we're victims of our own success. Most of the devices that come to market today or come to pre-market IDE trials or CE mark trials, they perform extremely well. They have a very low rate of adverse events and a low rate of failure. Perhaps with the exception of those that are being offered first to a population of patients that are near death. As such, if they do experience abnormalities, if there are adverse events, they tend to occur outside the window of a traditional pre-market clinical trial. And the numbers of patients that would be necessary to identify a risk or a rate would be so great that it wouldn't be possible. So the idea that we merge pre-market and post-market evidence generation, that the IDE study to some extent becomes a validation step that's based on a lot of work done preclinically that reduces the risk further, and that we continue to generate evidence is one that I think my colleagues in industry can and will and do embrace. There are other carrots to that we haven't addressed, such as the opportunity to generate evidence that can help us make decisions about the next generation device. How do we make our device better than the competitors? Also, evidence that may help us design a completely new device, a disruptive device that puts our current generation of devices, makes them obsolete. So I think if we expand the way we're thinking about this and don't look at it as just another cost, but an opportunity to reduce costs up front and gain opportunities thereafter, it changes the thinking.
Thank you so much. Jijo, I'd actually like to hear your perspective on the same thought process as Owen and Mark, from your perspective as being in leadership at J&J.
Sure. So I could almost echo what both of them have said. I think many of us have been in a situation leading product safety committees where you kind of wish, right? I wish I had that patient perspective because, yes, my adverse event data is telling me something. My medical affairs colleagues who are in the field talking to the surgeon are giving me a different perspective, but there's just this one perspective that's absolutely missing. And it's something that we've kind of debated to try and figure out how do we begin to bring that voice internally into some of these discussions. That said, the only other comment that I'd add is to something that Owen said earlier around that holy grail, and I think we are closer to that holy grail than we really think. Yes, we need UDI, yes, we need interoperability, but with the advances in technology, there's nothing that stops us today from doing away from our traditional definition of what a registry is, where we roll it out to a set population with a set of questions, and why we can't replace it with a variety of electronic tools that are available to us. It may not be the traditional EMRs yet. We don't have the clinical functionality that's needed to capture data, but maybe some of these customizable tools that can be rolled out along with the product so that we're collecting more real-time data and can live into that vision of preventing an event from happening rather than reacting to an event that has already happened.
Thank you. Jijo and Mark, as the clinicians represented on this particular panel, we've been talking throughout the day about clinical evidence, alternative ways of gathering evidence, and I wonder from a clinician's viewpoint, your confidence in this information, and then what are the messages that you would share with your clinicians in the field who are practicing day in and day out?
So I think the answer is yes. We would love to have the combination of that data. I think the big question becomes, how do you weight the evidence between the real world and what you're seeing in the clinical field? And again, as one of my colleagues talking to me earlier this afternoon was saying, it's also the culture of evidence, right? What is the level of appropriate evidence that's needed in that particular situation? What is the kind of decision that you're making? So I think there is an opportunity to bring both of those together. I think the piece that we're missing is that interoperability link between the two, so we're able to link and make sense out of it. But as a clinician, I would definitely welcome the opportunity to bring those bodies of evidence together.
I think the benefits of collecting real-world evidence post-market to clinicians are at least twofold. One being the opportunity to identify issues earlier and with more precision and with more actionable information. And the other alludes to a comment that Owen made about the potential to identify better ways to utilize a device, better ways to program a device, better ways to implant a device, or new indications and better indications for a device, whether that's identifying new things or potentially in some cases focusing the therapy where it's more effective.
To kind of continue the theme of connecting the real world and with the validation through an investigational type study, we clearly are seeing this transition within the agency from the pre-market to post-market. And also in the presentation, we saw Chip identify one of the areas where we could pinpoint an opportunity to drill further into optimizing the preclinical space is in the clinical trial sites. So really getting at the heart of what is stopping or what is preventing those institutions from being successful. And one of the questions that I have in this transition from pre to post is, how are we as industry, as regulators, as clinicians going to engage with the broader physician community and the research community to say, the importance in being able to explain the importance of post-market, because we hear time and time again where people don't want to be involved in those post-market activities. There's the mystique around the investigational studies. So how do we talk to those sites and explain to them the critical nature of the post-market activities? Anyone? I was kind of pointing it towards Mark and Jijo,
Okay.
but I think others might have some input as well.
So the byline when I was a young faculty member was publish or perish. And the challenges in publishing today are greater than ever before because of some of the fixed costs and just the time requirements in doing that sort of thing. Post-market studies today are very different than many of the post-market studies 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And people are publishing very interesting and provocative data that comes from all sorts of different sources. But for instance, we published, investigators who worked with us published recently on the importance of remote monitoring and how that impacts not only costs, but even morbidity and mortality, even with pacemakers, not just with ICDs, in groups of patients that are in the hundreds of thousands. And these are published in well-respected journals and gain the publishers, or the authors, I should say, great notoriety. So I'm oftentimes having that conversation with some of my physician colleague skeptics.
So I think that obviously post-market gathering of information is extremely important, but it's really difficult right now. We know that our medical device reporting is very underreported. We know that it's very difficult to enroll in standalone post-approval studies and keep patients in them and all of those sorts of things. So I'm not sure that we need to convince physicians so much of the importance of gathering the information. I think we more need to make it so much easier to gather it that they hardly notice. And so, having things like UDI, having higher, more consistency across EMRs, having registries that are more integrated into the care that patients are receiving, so that we're gathering post-market information just as patients are being cared for, and we have reliable information we can turn back to, that it isn't a standalone activity that takes time and money and additional focus. I think that's where we're getting stuck.
I think if there's anything I'd like to add to that is, in addition to all those changes, is incentivize them as part of their clinical practice to see the benefits of sharing this data or gathering this data. We've done that with the general physician population when it comes to outcomes. We gathered the data from them. You've got a whole set of HEDIS measures around ensuring your population is healthy. We need to look at this space with that lens to see how we can incentivize them to be willing to take this extra step.
And Jijo, from that standpoint of incentivizing, where do you see that coming from? Is that coming from industry? Does it come from hospital settings? Where the societies? Where is that?
I think I definitely do not see that coming from industry, because I would believe we've got an inherent conflict
Of course.
out there, of course. I think we need to work on policy, we need to work on guidelines, and actually I would pose the question to the payer organizations, because again, they do gain from better outcomes. So whether it's an opportunity to work that policy with payers to incentivize physicians.
Naomi, great lead in for you. What are your thoughts of the feedback from Jijo regarding incentivizing the hospitals and the physicians in participating in that post-market space?
Well, I think some of that has been done on a pilot basis in some plans with some particularly important issues that they wanted to resolve. I'm not sure it would be acceptable as a total universal response to everything. We are in an environment in which there are constraints. There will be more constraints. There is an increasing focus on value-based payment. Everybody, whether you're a payer or a bus driver, we're all expecting to do more with less. That's the nature of our environment. That's the nature of our global situation as well. So I'm encouraging with the understanding that that doesn't become a universal open door. I will also say that my own opinion is I would advocate as the feasibility and the vision develops into a reality for a continuum of evidence. I actually think we're in some ways stymied by our own dichotomous viewpoint. Nonetheless, contractually, that's rather difficult to administer, and plans are very concerned that once the coverage has been given, that they won't be able to adapt. I do believe that there are ways to address that, and I think we would do well to have a more continuous view of evidence. And in fact, there's a huge amount we don't know at the point where you have trials and market approval, much of which is, was it really going to work in the real world? Or which parts of the real world?
All right. Naomi, we heard earlier from Owen about the idea, his advice to the medical community was to come early, come often to visit with the FDA. And what advice would you give to industry with regard to payer decisions, understanding the thought processes that the payers are having currently, and then as those decisions and those thought processes evolve as additional evidence is acquired?
So I was very happy to join the pilot on payer and evidence generation that MDI is sponsoring. For some years, I felt that we need to be proactive in technology assessment. I think I heard from a presentation by Bill Murray that a typical PMA is 7 years and $39 million, and then it must be pretty frustrating when it comes to a coverage decision, an evidentiary decision, and we say, well, that's not there, and where's all that missing data? To me, and we have I think this is taking hold in our organization more broadly. We would be well advised to give that feedback early, as CDRH is trying to do with the Payer Communication Task Force to bring payers into the pre-submission meeting. I think it can be broader than that. I have been involved with in an organization, Excite International. It rises from the Ontario Innovation District. Its mission is to accelerate the pathway for truly novel, truly beneficial technologies. That is a standard of innovation which is not just novelty or new to the market, but is very substantive, to create trials and pathways that would align both regulatory and payer concerns, and to do this internationally. So with respect to the particular demonstration we had within the payer working group, Dan and Jing developed a use case, a theoretical case, saying this is the evidence, this is the trial data. I wrote a commentary on this. There were definitely concerns. I would not have made any threshold that we held. And then I was able to share them because I chair the payer advisory committee of this group. It was good for this group because we are still a new organization, and that allowed us to test the dimensions that are important to reviewing evidence, especially early protocols, as well as to have an example to work with. And there was very high consensus with that group, which has on it that committee Kaiser, Aetna, Ontario, NICE has just joined, Norway is represented, CMS participates as an observer. So that's a pretty good array. And I think contrary perhaps to the perception there, I don't know what the payer wants, everybody wants something different. There is very high consensus there. And I would really recommend My feeling is there has been a reticence in the part of industry to become involved in this type of early engagement. Perhaps there's a fear that regulators will become more of a barrier because somehow the payers will infect them, or just, you know, not showing. I really don't know what it is, but I really believe for the sake of the healthcare system, and I would say the health of the industry, as well as what payers can deliver to their beneficiaries, because we have a duty toward their population health and a fiduciary duty to the premiums that are paid to payers, for the premiums that are paid for payers. So I would like to encourage more acceptance of this and more participation, and I would certainly advise that it be through this MDIC pilot. I would not advise going door to door to 10 different health plans and saying, what do you think? You will not get, one, the kind of rigor we're able to offer on a national basis, and two, this opportunity to get an international viewpoint that we are able to do through Excite International.
Great, thank you for sharing that additional information about what's happening in the international space. So Randy, we've been talking in this panel about clinical evidence, gathering this information from real-world experiences, real patients. But something that you bring to the table is this experience and this development work through the virtual patient model. And I think it would be really helpful if maybe you took a minute or two and explained what that model is and how the information from that model could actually be used in computational work, so that maybe we are moving in that further and further away to large clinical trials and smaller sample sizes because of some of the work that you've been doing for MDIC.
Great. So we've been working at MDIC for nearly 5 years now. It's been a great organization, great partnering industry and FDA and other government organizations. And the key is the discussion, the positive discussion and the trust that's being built. And I think you can see in all the discussions today the optimism, all the progress that has been made, and what we have to look forward to going ahead. So virtual patient is really a framework to look at how to take the computational analysis and the statistical analysis that is there for us to leverage and build that into a mechanism to promote reduced clinical trials and better understanding of device and human interaction. And it's already been proven in pilots that we can have a significant impact, up to 50%, through some of the work that CHIP has sponsored in reducing the size of trials by using statistical data. Generally, the computational modeling and simulation has been a part of MDIC from day one. That was one of our big areas of focus in the early years and continuing even now. And with all the support from Kyle Meyer and Don Bardot and the team and all the sponsors and folks on the steering committee, we've made great progress in computational modeling and simulation to make that part of the discussion and to make that part of the science, regulatory science, of bringing products to market. And there's a tremendous upside yet ahead of us. We've made good progress. We've had some good pilot projects. We still have a lot of work to do to make this standard practice, to adopt across the industry, and to implement in a bigger way, such that every device really relates back to computation modeling and simulation, the virtual patient framework, and we're leveraging all of the data available to us, whether it's real-world evidence, prior clinical data, engineering data, or future clinical data that may need to be acquired. But pulling that together gives us a much bigger body of data to work with, and basing that on statistical work and computational modeling gives us the science behind the data to bring it forward as strong evidence in regulatory approvals. One of the thoughts around the science is, how do we move it forward even faster, even better? How do we drive the implementation further? And when you think about that, or when I think about that, I think of the stakeholder groups that are involved. You've got the engineers and scientists that are really creating the device, doing the product development work, looking at what data is available. I think of engineering management within the industry that is promoting the use of modeling and driving modeling on every project, not just the new projects, not just the projects that are breaking new ground in technology, but all projects. And then I think of the partnership between industry and FDA and MDIC and the regulatory approvals and adopting the data and the modeling and the computational work as part of that review and looking for that, making that an expectation. When I think about those stakeholder groups, I really turn back to myself as part of engineering management to say, I think I can probably have the biggest impact on that chain of results by really driving that expectation internally to the product development teams that engineering, modeling, computational analysis is part of the project. It's part of every project, whether it's a new indication or an line extension or a brand new product, incremental or breakthrough. It's an expectation that that modeling is part of the development project. And every time a team comes for a review, a design review or a progress report, that team knows that they're going to be asked, what does your computational model look like? What have you learned from your computational model? What data have you leveraged from prior products or prior projects? Where are you creating efficiency in your project based on this modeling initiative, and where have you leveraged data in order to either move to market more efficiently or move to a regulatory approval with good collaboration, or get to market even faster.
Great, thank you. I know we're getting close on time to answer some questions from the audience, but I want to pose one last question to the panel. And I want to take us back to a slide of Chip's. And he lays out for us this framework. I'll call it, maybe it's future state. Maybe that's the future state of where we want to be. I think if Dr. Schern was here, he'd probably say it needs to be like next year. Maybe it's 2019. Where is he?
In the back.
Oh, perfect. Probably 2019. Or so, but we know that there are challenges and different hurdles in being able to reach these lofty goals for a future state. And so, what I'd like to ask of the panel is, what do you think that we need to do as a collective community to support the adoption of these efforts that have been ongoing in MDIC? We heard Randy just talk about how it is already in their lexicon at Boston Scientific. It is in their work. And we heard from Naomi where it's going beyond the borders of the United States, that there are conversations occurring in other parts. And then Owen, with your work and others in MDIC with CHIP, of where things have gone with regard to early feasibility studies. So what do we tell this community of how do we keep moving forward with this adoption so that really that becomes not just future state, it's current state?
Take one crack at it. So we had an interesting conversation over lunch. I think that, this slide is why MDIC exists, to bring all of these stakeholders together and have the conversations that need to happen to start making progress in these spaces. But once we have a product, we make progress in this space, we each have a responsibility to take it back to our home and integrate it into what we do and integrate it into the knowledge base of the people that we work with that maybe aren't intimately familiar with what happens at MDIC. And that includes the agency. We have a lot of agency participation in many of these projects, which is wonderful, but we also have a lot of agency folks who have no idea what MDIC does. And so that's on me, and it's on Jeff, and it's on other people that are in the room here to make that happen. And I think that's probably true in many of our organizations around the room today, that to make this really a reality, we have to take what we're doing here and bring it back and socialize it in our organizations.
Certainly that applies the same way to industry. Our ability to take this information and cascade through the organizations, both vertically and horizontally, with all the suppliers that we use and engage in product development programs. It's our responsibility to cascade the same way. aggressively and consistently and with good expectation that we're going to implement.
And our ability to show demonstrable value and ROI in doing that. I think we need to do a better job of communicating that internally as well.
Go ahead, Chip.
I was just going to make a comment that what I've observed over the last 2 to 3 years is it's really easy to write down objectives that are, boil the ocean type objectives, to dramatically transform the ecosystem. And that becomes unachievable and discouraging for a lot of the participants when they're working in that area. And what I found a lot of the tricks is trying to find a bite-sized nugget that could be meaningfully moved forward, and that the process and the journey is as important as the outcome. Is that when you get everybody engaged and you make some small improvement in the overall ecosystem, it really breaks down a lot of barriers and you make steady progress towards the larger goals, even though you've only been working on a small bite-sized nugget.
So all of us here were at the same lunch discussion, and I would submit that I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. At least not sufficient to cause what we want and need to occur in the time frame in which we need it to occur, 2018, 2019, Dr. Shuren. And if a company did what we're doing, the company would go bankrupt because their products wouldn't sell. They'd just sit out there and languish. We create wonderful white papers, articles in medical journals, and people read them, and then they set them aside. We need, I believe, and many of the people in lunch believed, processes, an organization that's, or people who are specifically responsible for adoption and driving adoption of the wonderful tools that this organization is creating.
All right, I'd like to open the floor to any questions that you might have for this very distinguished panel.
Hi, Bram Zuckerman, FDA. Chip had a wonderful talk to start this program, and I'd like to ask both Mark and Jennifer to comment on one of his key points. In talking about the state of the early feasibility studies programs in the United States, Chip indicated that the structural reform needed at clinical sites and between industry and clinical sites is paramount. Chip raised the idea of a hospital site consortium being developed as a pilot to test out some ideas about uniform contracting, speedier IRB approval, etc. As people in the cardiovascular world who've had to deal with clinical sites and their inefficiencies, how would you react to some of Chip's proposals? Mark?
Oh, I got chosen to go first. You're off the hook. I've considered that over the last several months after seeing the proposal, and I think it has a lot of value. There are some common issues that are usually the barriers at almost every site that you would want to go to for an early feasibility study. Having said that, when you get down to different disciplines, some of the barriers and the issues may vary from one discipline to the next, and they may vary somewhat between sites. I think about one of our greatest stumbling blocks is often intellectual property. And it's an issue, the more valuable perhaps academically the site is, the more likely it is to have an intellectual property issue. So I really do think there's value in pursuing this, Chip, and I think it's a great idea and we should do it. I'm not completely confident that it will be the panacea that we're looking for, but again, necessary, but perhaps not sufficient.
Sure. Jennifer?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Zuckerman. I'm with Mark. I'm intrigued by the idea, and I do think that there is value in pursuing that particular initiative. However, I would like us to be able to really engage at that site level, because I think that again, is one piece of this puzzle. We've been talking about the agency, we've been talking about the industry, we've been talking about patients, but we also need to take into account the input from those institutions as well, and really understanding what their barriers are, and why clinical research is perhaps slower, or that there are challenges that exist inside their organization. The truth is they really do want to do the research, but there are certain barriers that we may actually be the ones who bring the barrier to the table. It's not necessarily inside their institution, based upon a particular study design.
So Bram, I want to make it clear, I support it, and I think there are a lot of reasons to do it. One of them just to shine a light on the issue. I think that alone will create momentum that may help us to address a lot of the problems.
These were great comments. I don't know if, Chip, you want to add anything?
Oh, thank you, Bram. I've been in that situation before. I think I've been surprised. So I've been involved with 100+ clinical studies. I've actually signed the contracts, have watched site after site individually negotiate with sponsor after sponsor each of these agreements over and over and over again, with every company keeping their template of negotiation proprietary, and every site being having the same thing. And to break down that kind of process inefficiency, so that there's a consensus approach towards some of these issues, I think would just be terrific. I will tell you, I was at FDA when it took about a year to get an IDE approved. And there was a general view that that process could not be improved at all without sacrificing the integrity of the process. And it was very interesting when process improvement actually occurred, under Owen's leadership. That's a 30+ day process now. It took a year out of a development process. I think this process of actually running a study is ripe for similar process improvement, and this is a place to start.
I agree, Chip, and we have a model that works in many instances that most companies engage in, and that's a master trials agreement.
Right.
And for most institutions that works. There are a few for which you sign a master's trial agreement and then they forget it exists.
Right.
But it's a model that could be applied here.
Yep.
As far as a closing thought, I'm glad, Chip, that you brought up the fact that there's such a decrease in the time to an IDE approval, and where that came from was industry organizations working with the agency and giving that feedback. So again, when we're thinking about it from the site perspective, let's get that feedback from those sites to find out where they're struggling, because again, I think wouldn't it be incredible to go from a year to 30 days in an enrollment period and move right into that follow-up phase. So as far as the concluding remark for this particular panel, we've clearly seen from Chip's presentation that there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been going on with different stakeholders across the medical device community through that direction from the agency of really wanting to find a better way and to steal some words from Owen, it's really incumbent upon us that not only is our call to action to take care of patients, but our call to action is to take these conversations from today, to take them back into our respective organizations. That's our responsibility so that we can actually have some action and see what happens in a year or 2 years or 5 years from now to really get to that future state of a new paradigm for clinical research. So thank you, panel, for staying a little bit longer and continuing to engage with this audience. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.